The exhibition hall on Meridian Station stretched as far as the eye could see. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy filled every corner of the massive space. The air hummed with a dozen different languages, all mixing together through universal translators. Holographic displays floated everywhere, showing off the latest breakthroughs in galactic farming. One display showed cattle-like creatures that grew from birth to full size in just 3 days. Another demonstrated plants that produced fruit every morning like clockwork. Genetic engineers from advanced civilizations had turned agriculture into something that looked more like magic than farming. Mike Crawford stood in a quiet corner of all this chaos. He was alone at his small booth, watching the crowds pass by without much interest in what he had to offer. His display was simple compared to the flashy holograms around him. Just a clear plastic box sitting on a plain metal table. Inside that box was a creature that didn't look like much of anything. The little thing was about the size of a football. Its skin hung loose and wrinkled, colored a dull gray that seemed almost lifeless. A few thin feathers poked out here and there, barely enough to count. The creature's eyes were too big for its head, making it look perpetually surprised. Every few moments, it would let out a weak chirp and shift its weight awkwardly from one foot to the other. Mike had spent 3 full months traveling to reach this station. The journey from New Harvest Colony had been long and expensive. He'd used most of his savings just to get here. His clothes showed what kind of man he was. Simple blue jeans worn at the knees from honest work. A flannel shirt that had seen better days. Boots that were built for walking through mud, not polished station floors. He looked completely out of place among the aliens in their elegant robes and suits that glowed with their own light. People walked past his booth without stopping. Some glanced at the ugly creature in the box and kept moving. Others didn't even look. Mike didn't blame them. He knew how it appeared. Here were all these incredible achievements in genetic engineering, and he was showing off something that looked half dead. Then a voice cut through the noise of the exhibition hall like a knife. "Is that supposed to be livestock?" The voice was loud and filled with disbelief. Mike looked up to see a group of beings approaching his booth. Leading them was someone who could only be royalty. Prince Davrik of the Talvern Empire stood 7 feet tall, his body covered in scales that shimmered between purple and blue depending on how the light hit them. Each scale seemed to have been polished individually. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Behind the prince came his entourage. At least 20 beings followed him like a traveling court. There were advisors in formal robes, scientists with scanning equipment, and several small floating drones that recorded everything. Those drones were broadcasting to billions of viewers across multiple star systems. The prince never went anywhere without his audience. Prince Davrik stopped directly in front of Mike's booth. His large eyes focused on the creature in the clear box. For a moment he just stared at it in silence. Then he started laughing. It wasn't the kind of polite laugh you give when someone tells a bad joke. This was genuine, full-body laughter. The sound echoed off the high ceiling of the exhibition hall. The prince's entourage joined in immediately. His advisors chuckled and whispered to each other. The scientists tried to hide their smiles behind their hands. Even the media drones seemed to focus their cameras more intently, as if they knew this was the kind of moment that would be replayed across the galaxy. "Human," Prince Davrik said, his voice carrying easily through his translator device. The crystal hung around his neck, glowing softly as it converted his words into something Mike could understand. "Surely this is a joke. Tell me you're joking." Mike said nothing yet. He'd learned that sometimes silence was the best response. The prince gestured at the wrinkled creature in the box. "The Talvern Empire produces livestock that reaches full maturity in 6 days. 6 days. From hatching to harvest in less than a week. Our creatures are genetically perfect. They require minimal food. They produce triple the protein of any natural animal. And that thing, looks like it will die before it even learns to walk properly." By now a crowd had gathered. Other exhibitors and attendees moved closer to see what was causing such amusement. Mike recognized some of them from the opening ceremonies. There was a crystalline merchant from Sector 9, its body made of living glass that chimed musically when it moved. Now that chiming sounded like laughter. A floating gas entity from the Nebula Collective drifted nearby, its cloudy form pulsing with colors that Mike's translator helpfully informed him indicated mockery and contempt. More aliens pressed in closer. A reptilian trader pointed at Mike's creature and made a gesture that needed no translation. A 4-armed technician from the inner worlds took a picture with her scanning device, probably to share with friends as a joke. The laughter spread like a wave through that section of the exhibition hall. Mike stood there and took it all. He'd expected this reaction. He'd prepared himself for it during the long journey here. Humanity was still the new kid in galactic society. Humans had only made first contact with alien life about 60 years ago. 2 generations. That was nothing compared to civilizations that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. To most of these advanced species, humans seemed hopelessly primitive. Earth's technology was centuries behind the galactic standard. Human ships were slow. Human computers were bulky. And human farming methods looked like something from ancient history. While other species had mastered genetic engineering, humans were still doing things the old way. Planting seeds. Raising animals by hand. Waiting for nature to take its course. "Your Highness," Mike finally said, keeping his voice steady and calm. "I'm not asking you to believe me now. I'm asking you to come back in 6 months." The laughter got louder. 6 months. The very idea seemed absurd to these beings who measured agricultural cycles in days or weeks. Prince Davrick's eye ridges rose high on his scaled face. This was apparently the Talvern version of raising eyebrows in surprise. 6 months? Human, do you understand what you're saying? My creatures complete 3 full breeding cycles in that time. They produce protein yields that could feed entire planets. They've been optimized down to the molecular level by the finest geneticists in 12-star systems. The prince leaned closer to the clear box, studying the ugly creature inside with something between fascination and disgust. What could your thing possibly accomplish in 6 months? Will it learn to stand without falling over? Will its feathers finally grow in? Will it stop looking like something that crawled out of a swamp? The crowd loved this. More laughter. More mocking gestures. Mike saw several beings recording the interaction, probably to post on whatever social networks their species used. He could imagine the headlines already. Foolish human challenges galactic prince. Primitive farmer thinks he can compete. Earth colony displays agricultural failure. But Mike didn't get angry. He didn't get defensive. He just stood there with his hands resting calmly on his simple metal table. Inside the clear box, the ugly creature chirped again and blinked its 2 large eyes at all the noise and attention. "Come back and see," Mike said simply. Just those 4 words. Nothing more. The transport ship descended through New Harvest's atmosphere with a low rumble that Mike felt in his chest. He sat in the cargo section, surrounded by crates and equipment, with one hand resting protectively on the clear enclosure beside him. Inside, the small creature he'd named Ruby slept through the landing, unbothered by the vibrations and noise. 3 weeks had passed since the exhibition on Meridian Station. 3 weeks of travel through space, jumping from station to station, dealing with customs officials who didn't understand why anyone would transport livestock this way. Most species just shipped genetic codes and grew their animals on-site. But Mike needed Ruby with him. She wasn't just a project. She was a living being that needed care. The ship touched down with a gentle bump. Mike gathered his things and carefully lifted Ruby's enclosure. He was tired down to his bones. Space travel always exhausted him, and he'd barely slept during the journey. Every few hours he checked on Ruby, making sure her environment stayed stable, that she had food and water, that the stress of travel wasn't harming her. When the cargo ramp lowered, Mike stepped out into familiar air. New Harvest didn't smell like recycled station atmosphere. It smelled like soil and growing things. Like home. The spaceport wasn't much to look at. Just a flat field that had been cleared of the native purple grass. A few prefabricated buildings sat at one edge, their metal walls already showing rust from the morning dew. A hand-painted sign near the entrance read, "Welcome to New Harvest. Population 8,847. Someone had crossed out the last number and written 8,848 below it. Probably the Miller baby that was born last month. This was nothing like the massive, gleaming structure of Meridian Station. No holographic displays. No thousands of aliens from across the galaxy. Just a quiet little landing pad on a human colony world that most of the galaxy had never heard of. Mike spotted the old pickup truck parked near the building. His wife Beth leaned against it, her blonde hair pulled back in the no-nonsense ponytail she always wore for farm work. Next to her, barely able to stand still, was their daughter Kelly. The 12-year-old girl bounced on her toes, trying to see past the other passengers leaving the ship. "Dad! Dad!" Kelly shouted the moment she spotted him. She ran across the field, her boots kicking up small clouds of red dust. Beth followed at a more reasonable pace, but Mike could see the smile on her face. He'd been gone for almost 2 months total. First preparing for the exhibition, then the travel there, the event itself, and the journey back. It was the longest he'd been away from the farm since they'd settled here 15 years ago. Kelly reached him first and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You're back. Did you bring her? Is that Ruby?" Let me see. Careful, Beth said as she caught up, but she was already looking at the enclosure in Mike's hands. Her smile faltered slightly when she saw what was inside. Mike set the enclosure down gently on the truck's tailgate. Kelly pressed her face close to the clear plastic, her breath fogging the surface. That's Ruby? Kelly's voice had lost some of its excitement. Dad, she's kind of... She looked up at her father, clearly trying to find nice words. You can say it, Mike told her with a tired smile. She's really ugly, Kelly admitted. Kelly? Beth's voice had that sharp motherly tone, but Mike just laughed. It felt good to laugh after weeks of stress and travel. She is ugly, he agreed, looking down at Ruby. The creature looked even worse after the journey. Her wrinkled skin seemed grayer than before. The few sparse feathers she had were ruffled and messy. Her oversized eyes blinked slowly in the natural sunlight, probably overwhelmed after weeks under artificial lights. Right now she is. But do you remember what your grandfather always used to tell me about farming? Kelly rolled her eyes the way only a 12-year-old could, but she recited the words she'd heard 100 times before. Patience beats perfection. Every single time. Every single time, Mike echoed, picking up the enclosure again. Now let's get her home. She's had a rough trip. They loaded everything into the truck. Beth drove while Mike sat in the back with Ruby, keeping the enclosure stable on the bumpy dirt road that led to their farm. Kelly knelt backward in her seat, watching Ruby through the truck's rear window, fascination overcoming her initial disappointment. The Crawford farm spread across 200 acres of New Harvest's most fertile land. Mike and Beth had claimed this plot during the colony's second wave of settlement, back when Kelly was just a baby. The planet was Earth-like in most ways that mattered. Gravity was almost identical. The atmosphere was breathable. Water was plentiful. The sun was a bit yellower than Earth's, and the day lasted 26 hours instead of 24, but humans adapted quickly. What made New Harvest challenging was its youth. The planet was geologically active, its ecosystem still finding balance. The soil had the right minerals but lacked the complex organic networks that Earth's soil had developed over billions of years. Earth crops grew here but slowly and with constant attention. Everything on New Harvest required patience. You couldn't force things. You had to work with what the planet gave you. Maybe that's why Mike had chosen this world for his experiment. If Ruby could thrive here, she could thrive anywhere. The farmhouse came into view, a sturdy wooden structure that Mike had built with his own hands using native timber. Beside it stood the large barn, equally handmade, its walls weathered but strong. Fields stretched in every direction, some planted with earth wheat, others with hybrid crops that combined Earth and New Harvest genetics. Mike carried Ruby straight to the barn. He'd spent months before leaving preparing her habitat. A large enclosed space with climate controls, proper ventilation, adjustable lighting. Beth helped him connect everything while Kelly measured out Ruby's food according to the detailed instructions Mike had written before his trip. The galactic news networks are going crazy, Beth said, checking her datapad while she worked. Look at this headline. She turned the screen toward Mike. The headline read, Foolish Human Farmer Gambles Everything on Ugly Bird. The article below included a photo of Mike at his small booth, looking tired and out of place among the galactic elite. Ugly bird, Mike repeated, glancing at Ruby. Well, they're not wrong about the ugly part. There's another one, Beth scrolled down. Primitive human methods no match for galactic science. Oh, and this one, Prince Davrick takes pity on delusional farmer, accepts pointless wager. Do they mention how it ends? Mike asked. The story about the ugly duckling? Beth looked confused for a moment, then understanding crossed her face. That's an Earth fairy tale. They wouldn't know it. Should we tell them? Mike smiled as he finished setting up Ruby's water system. Where would be the fun in that? Let them wait and see. The first month back home was the hardest part of the entire project. Mike woke up every morning while it was still dark outside. New Harvest's longer day meant dawn came later, but he was always in the barn before the sun rose. He checked Ruby's vital signs using the simple scanner he'd built himself. He adjusted the temperature by fractions of a degree based on her behavior. He tested her food mixture, making tiny changes to optimize her nutrition. This wasn't anything like what the Talvarans did. They programmed genetic code like writing computer software. They specified exactly how an animal should grow, what proteins it should produce, how fast it should mature. Then they just watched it happen according to plan. What Mike did was husbandry. The old way. The way humans had been raising animals for 10,000 years, Since the first farmers on ancient Earth convinced wild wolves to become dogs and wild chickens to lay eggs in coops instead of hiding them in bushes. You couldn't program husbandry into a computer. You had to watch the animal. Learn its personality. Understand what it needed, not what you wanted it to need. Make adjustments based on observation, not theory. It was slow. It was hands-on. It required being there every single day, multiple times a day. Ruby grew, but nothing like the Talvern livestock. By the end of week 4, she doubled in size. That sounds impressive until you realize she'd gone from football-sized to basketball-sized. Her feathers were starting to come in, but just barely. Tiny points of color poked through her gray skin like the first grass pushing through soil in spring. Meanwhile, the galactic news kept coming. Every week brought new updates about Prince Davrick's prize animals. They were already in their second complete breeding cycle. Thousands of offspring. Protein production numbers that broke records across multiple sectors. Genetic perfection on display for the entire galaxy to admire. And every week, Mike's datapad filled with angry messages. Investment firms that had cautiously put money into his project demanded refunds. They'd expected quick returns. They'd thought supporting a human farmer might be interesting, different. Now they saw their investment literally sitting in a barn, growing at a pace that seemed glacial compared to galactic standards. Alien business partners who'd signed contracts to try human methods started backing out. They sent polite messages with legal excuses, but the meaning was clear. They'd lost faith. They didn't want to wait 6 months for something that might not work when they could use proven Talvern methods and see results in days. Mike deleted most of the messages without responding. There was no point arguing. Either Ruby would succeed or she wouldn't. Words wouldn't change that. But not everyone gave up. Some messages were different. Month 5 arrived on New Harvest with the kind of crisp morning that made everything feel possible. Mike woke up earlier than usual, though he couldn't say exactly why. Some instinct told him today would be different. He pulled on his work clothes in the dark, trying not to wake Beth, and headed down to the barn through the pre-dawn silence. But when he pushed open the barn door, he found Beth already there. She stood completely motionless about 10 feet from Ruby's habitat, one hand covering her mouth. She hadn't turned on the main lights, just the soft glow that ran along the floor for nighttime checks. In that gentle illumination, she looked like she'd seen something impossible. "Mike," she whispered without turning around. Her voice was barely audible. "Look." Mike moved to stand beside his wife, and his breath caught in his throat. For a long moment he couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only stare at what stood before him in the habitat. Ruby had transformed completely. The ugly, wrinkled creature with patchy gray skin was gone. In her place stood something magnificent. She'd grown to the size of a large eagle, her body now perfectly proportioned. But it was her feathers that stole Mike's ability to think clearly. They weren't just one color. Ruby's plumage seemed to capture and hold light in ways Mike had never seen before. Deep crimson covered most of her body, but when she shifted her weight, that red flickered into brilliant gold. Then, depending on the angle, touches of violet and deep blue shimmered through like oil on water. It was as if someone had taken a sunset and woven it into feathers. Her crest rose proudly from her head, each feather perfectly aligned. Her wings, folded neatly against her sides, showed hints of the impressive span they'd have when extended. Even her eyes had changed. They were still large, but now they fit her face properly. More than that, they held something Mike recognized. Intelligence. Awareness. When Ruby looked at him, he felt genuinely seen in a way that livestock shouldn't be capable of. But none of that was what had frozen Beth in place. Beneath Ruby, carefully arranged in the bedding material Mike had provided, sat 3 eggs. They were perfect ovals, each one about the size of a grapefruit. Their shells had a pearlescent quality that caught the low light and reflected it in soft, shifting colors. "She's in her production cycle," Mike said, his voice coming out rough with emotion. "Beth, she's already producing." The timeline predicted another 2 weeks minimum. His hands trembled as he pulled his scanner from his belt. It was a simple device, nothing like the advanced equipment the Talverons used, but it was accurate enough for what he needed. He activated it and slowly moved it over the eggs, being careful not to disturb Ruby, who watched him with those intelligent eyes. The data that appeared on the small screen made Mike's hands shake harder. He had to read it 3 times to believe what he was seeing. The protein matrix inside each egg was incredibly complex. Far more complex than his computer simulations had predicted. But that wasn't the remarkable part. The remarkable part was how the proteins were structured. They weren't fixed. They were adaptive. The molecular arrangement would literally change based on whatever species consumed them, adjusting to provide optimal nutrition for that specific biology. Mike had hoped for something like this, but seeing it actually work was different. This was Earth biology operating at its absolute finest. 4 billion years of evolution. 4 billion years of life adapting to every possible environment, every challenge, every opportunity. Humans hadn't created this capability. They'd simply worked with what Earth had already spent eons perfecting. By combining Ruby's Earth-based genetics with carefully selected compatible material from other worlds, Mike had let nature do what nature did best. Adapt. Survive. Thrive. Dad? Dad. The barn door crashed open. Kelly came running in, her school backpack bouncing on her shoulders. She was supposed to be getting ready for the bus, but clearly she'd noticed both her parents were missing from the house. Is something wrong? Is Ruby okay? Then Kelly saw Ruby and she stopped so suddenly that she nearly fell forward. Her mouth dropped open. She's beautiful, Kelly breathed. Dad, look at her. She's actually beautiful. Ruby responded to Kelly's voice. She turned her head and made a sound that was nothing like her earlier weak chirps. This was a clear, melodic call that filled the barn with warmth. It almost sounded like Ruby was singing. More than that, it sounded like Ruby was greeting Kelly specifically, recognizing the girl who'd helped feed her and clean her habitat for the past 5 months. Kelly approached the habitat slowly, respectfully. Ruby watched her come, that intelligent gaze tracking every movement. When Kelly was close enough, Ruby leaned forward slightly, pressing against the transparent wall where Kelly's hand rested on the outside. She knows me, Kelly whispered, wonder filling her voice. Dad, she actually knows who I am. That's the difference, Mike said quietly, moving to stand beside his daughter. The Talvarans engineer recognition out of their animals. They make them compliant through genetics, easy to manage, predictable. But Ruby's learned to trust us. Real trust. The kind you have to earn over time. Beth had finally moved from her frozen position. She came to stand on Mike's other side, completing their small family circle around the habitat. The ugly duckling became a swan, she said softly, referencing the old Earth fairy tale. Mike pulled out his communicator. His thumb hovered over it for just a moment. Once he sent this message, everything would change. The waiting would be over. The real test would begin. He took a deep breath and composed his words carefully. Your Highness, the 6 months are complete. Ruby is ready for your inspection. I respectfully request that you honor our wager at your earliest convenience. Coordinates attached. He sent the message before he could second-guess himself. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Mike, Beth, and Kelly stood together in the quiet barn, watching Ruby settle back down over her eggs protectively. Then the communicator buzzed. Mike looked down at the screen. The response had come much faster than he'd expected. Prince Davrik had replied within an hour. The message read, I will arrive in 1 week with full media coverage. Prepare yourself for humiliation, human. The galaxy will witness your failure. Mike read the words twice, but something felt off. He activated his communicator's advanced functions, the ones that analyzed linguistic patterns and translated text. The software flagged something interesting. In the original Talvaran language, there were subtle undertones that the basic translation didn't capture. Uncertainty. Maybe even concern. The prince's confident words didn't match his actual linguistic patterns. He was trying to sound certain, but underneath there was doubt. He's worried, Mike said, showing the analysis to Beth. Good, Beth replied with a slight smile. He should be. The next week transformed their quiet farm into something resembling organized chaos. Mike had never seen so many people on New Harvest at once, let alone on his property. Beth took charge of organizing the space, setting up viewing areas that wouldn't disturb Ruby or the other animals. Kelly helped whenever she wasn't in school, running messages between different areas of the farm and generally being more useful than a 12-year-old had any right to be. Messages flooded in from across the galaxy. Some were supportive. Many were not. But one name kept appearing in Mike's inbox. Kravik, the reptilian trader from HFY 4 who'd purchased 3 of Ruby's siblings months ago. His messages came almost every hour, each one more excited than the last. His 3 hatchlings were transforming too. Everything Mike had taught him about patience and observation was paying off. Kravik's creatures were showing the same early development, the same intelligent awareness, the same beautiful plumage. For the first time in 50 years of trying, HFY 4's harsh desert environment was going to have sustainable livestock. Mr. Crawford, one of Kravik's messages read. Mike had that one displayed on his datapad now, reading it again while he worked. Whatever happens when the prince arrives, you should know something. You've given my people hope. Real, genuine hope. Not the false promise of quick fixes, but actual sustainable hope. For 50 years, we've watched our children go hungry while we tried every technological solution the galaxy offered. Nothing worked. Nothing lasted. But your method, your patience, your wisdom, it's working. Thank you. Whatever else happens, thank you. Mike saved that message in a special folder. He had a feeling he'd want to read it again later, especially if things didn't go well with Prince Davrik. The day of the prince's arrival came faster than Mike expected. He woke that morning to the sound of ships in the sky. New Harvest's small spaceport, which normally saw maybe 1 or 2 ships per week, was completely overwhelmed. Media drones from 50 different species filled the air like a swarm of metallic insects. Their cameras pointed in every direction, recording everything. 3 major galactic news networks had sent full broadcast teams. Ships bearing their corporate logos sat on every available flat surface near the spaceport. Representatives from the colonial administration had arrived the night before, setting up in New Harvest's only hotel. They'd already visited Mike twice, barely concealing their nervousness. If this demonstration failed, if the wager went badly, human colonies across this entire sector would lose their agricultural trading rights. Thousands of families depended on what happened today. No pressure at all. Then, right at local noon, Prince Davrik's personal ship appeared in the sky. It didn't just land. It descended with what Mike could only describe as unnecessary drama. The engines flared in complex patterns, creating geometric shapes in the air with their exhaust. The hull was polished to such a high shine that it reflected the sun like a mirror, forcing people to look away from the glare. When the ship finally touched down, it did so with perfect precision in the exact center of the spaceport. The landing ramp extended slowly, building anticipation. Then Prince Davrik emerged. He wore formal armor today, not the simpler clothes he'd worn at the exhibition 5 months ago. Every scale on his body had been polished until it shone. The armor itself looked ceremonial, covered in engravings that Mike's datapad helpfully identified as Talvran symbols of agricultural supremacy. The prince looked every inch the galactic royalty he was, towering and impressive and absolutely confident in his superiority. Behind him came his entourage, and it had grown significantly. Mike counted at least 40 individuals. Scientists with scanning equipment. Geneticists with portable labs. Agricultural specialists carrying devices Mike didn't recognize. Political advisors in formal robes. And, of course, even more media drones adding to the swarm already filling the sky. This wasn't just a prince coming to check on a wager. This was a full royal procession, broadcast to billions of viewers across dozens of star systems. Mike stood waiting at his barn entrance, wearing the same flannel and denim he always wore. Beth stood on one side of him, Kelly on the other. They looked like exactly what they were, farmers. Simple, hard-working farmers facing down galactic royalty. The procession made its way from the spaceport to the Crawford farm. Every step was recorded. Every moment analyzed and commented on by news anchors speaking languages Mike couldn't identify. When Prince Davrik finally stood before them, the entire galaxy watched to see what would happen next. The demonstration lasted 3 hours. Prince Davrik and his entire entourage crowded into Mike's barn, which suddenly felt much smaller than it actually was. Media drones hovered everywhere, their cameras capturing every angle. Scientists pointed scanning devices at Ruby, at her eggs, at the habitat itself. Geneticists argued in low voices, comparing data on their portable screens. Agricultural specialists took notes on devices that floated beside them, recording everything. Mike showed them everything. He explained Ruby's development timeline in detail, comparing it week by week to the predictions he'd made 5 months ago. He demonstrated the feeding protocols he'd used, the environmental adjustments, the behavioral observations that had guided his decisions. He cracked open one of Ruby's eggs carefully and ran it through every test the Talvran scientists requested. The results spoke for themselves. Ruby's eggs contained adaptive proteins that could nourish any species safely and efficiently. The genetic structure showed no signs of the degradation that plagued Talvran livestock. Ruby herself displayed intelligence and awareness far beyond what artificially accelerated creatures could achieve. She was healthy, sustainable, and already producing a second clutch of eggs. By the end of the demonstration, even the most skeptical Talvran scientists had gone quiet. The data was undeniable. What took Talvran methods 6 days to produce would collapse by Generation 3. What took Mike's methods 6 months to produce would thrive for generations. Prince Davrik stood at the front of the group, staring at Ruby for a long time. His scales had darkened slightly, which Mike's datapad informed him indicated either anger or deep embarrassment in Talvran body language. Finally, the prince turned to face Mike directly. "I've lost the wager," Davrik said, his voice carrying clearly despite the translator. "Earth retains its agricultural trading rights. I must endorse your products throughout the Talvern Empire. That was our agreement and I will honor it." The gathered crowd waited, sensing there was more coming. "But," Davrik continued and his voice dropped lower, "I need to ask you something in private. Without the cameras. Without the audience. Just you and me speaking honestly." Mike glanced at Beth, who gave a slight nod. "All right, Your Highness. Let's talk inside." 20 minutes later, they sat in the Crawford family's kitchen. It was a strange scene. Prince Davrik of the Talvern Empire, one of the most powerful individuals in 3-star systems, hunched awkwardly in a wooden chair that was too small for his 7-foot frame. His ceremonial armor sat carefully propped by the door. Without it, he wore simpler clothes underneath, and somehow that made him look less like untouchable royalty and more like a person carrying a heavy burden. Beth had made coffee despite the prince's initial protests. Now he held a mug in both hands, staring at the dark liquid like he was trying to read the future in its surface. Mike sat across the table from him. Kelly sat beside her father, included in this conversation because Mike believed his daughter was old enough to understand what was really happening here. Beth leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, watching everything with her usual quiet assessment. The media drones were gone. Davrik had ordered them away personally, much to their operator's disappointment. What happened in this kitchen wouldn't be broadcast to billions. This was private. "I've lost the wager," Davrik repeated, but this time his voice was different. "Tired. Earth keeps its agricultural trading rights, and I must endorse your products throughout my empire. That was what we agreed to 5 months ago." "That was our agreement," Mike confirmed, sipping his own coffee. "But I think we both know that's not really enough. Not for what you're actually facing." Davrik's translator crystal hummed as he made a sound that came out like wind whistling through hollow crystals. Mike's datapad identified it as a Talvern Psi. "You've seen the reports. The leaked data. You know our agricultural system is collapsing." "I've seen them," Mike admitted. "Then you know we have maybe 18 months before the crisis becomes undeniable. 2 years at most before we can't feed our core worlds without massive imports. We've built an entire civilization on a foundation that's crumbling beneath us." Davrik took a drink of the coffee, made a face at the bitterness, but continued drinking anyway. "We force perfection. We thought we could program nature like we program computers. Just tell DNA what to do and watch it happen exactly as specified. Nature doesn't work like that," Beth said from her position at the counter. Her voice wasn't unkind, just stating a fact. "You can't force living things into perfection. Life isn't code. It's messy and complicated and it needs time to work properly." "We thought we'd surpassed nature," Davrik said quietly. "We thought we were better than these primitive methods. Better than waiting. Better than patience." He gestured vaguely toward the barn outside. "No offense intended to your methods." "None taken," Mike replied. "Because here's what I'm going to offer you, Your Highness. I'll teach you the human method. Not sell it to you. Not license it for billions of credits. Teach it. Freely." Davrik's head snapped up, his large eyes focusing intently on Mike. "Why would you do that? You could name any price right now. Any price at all. My empire would pay it. We're desperate." "Because that's not how farming works," Kelly spoke up suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her, and her cheeks flushed red with embarrassment, but Mike gave her an encouraging nod. She took a breath and continued. "My dad always says farming isn't about winning. It's about growing things. And you can't grow anything good if you start from greed or from taking advantage of desperate people. You just can't." Mike reached over and squeezed his daughter's shoulder proudly. Exactly what she said. Prince Davrik stared at Kelly for a long moment, then at Mike, then at Beth. He seemed to be trying to understand if this was real or some kind of negotiating tactic. "But there must be terms," he finally said. "Conditions. Payments. Something." "There are conditions," Mike agreed, setting down his coffee mug. "But they're not about money. First condition, you have to understand this won't be quick. The human method takes time. Real time. You'll need patience, and I'm talking about a lot of patience. Years of it. You won't see instant results like you're used to." Davrik nodded slowly. "And the second condition?" "Second, you can't just take our techniques and disappear. This has to be a genuine partnership. Knowledge sharing works both ways. You people have technology that's centuries ahead of ours. We have agricultural wisdom that goes back thousands of years. We need to combine them, learn from each other, work together." "And the third condition?" Davrik asked. Beth pushed off from the counter and walked to the table, placing both hands on its surface as she looked directly at the prince. Third, and this is the most important one, you have to fundamentally change how you think about agriculture. Stop thinking about it as dominating nature or forcing outcomes. Stop treating living things like they're just biological machines you can program. You have to learn to work with life instead of against it. The kitchen fell silent except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Ruby's melodic calls from the barn. Davrik sat motionless, processing what he'd just heard. Mike could see the wheels turning behind those large eyes, weighing options, calculating consequences. Then Prince Davrik did something that startled everyone. He laughed. But it wasn't the mocking laughter from 5 months ago at the exhibition. This was genuine amusement mixed with self-recognition. The kind of laugh you make when you suddenly see your own foolishness clearly. My grandfather would have accepted your offer immediately, Davrik said, still chuckling. Before we had genetic engineering, before we discovered rapid growth formulas, the Talvern people were farmers. Real farmers like you. We grew our food slowly and carefully. We understood our animals. We worked with our crops instead of against them. He paused, his laughter fading into something more thoughtful. Then we discovered we could speed everything up. We could cut months off growth cycles. We could engineer perfect traits into every generation. And we convinced ourselves that faster meant better. That control meant superiority. We forgot everything our ancestors knew because we thought we'd found something better. Faster isn't always better, Mike said gently. Sometimes slow is what makes something strong. Sometimes patience is what makes something last. Prince Davrik stood up, his full height making the kitchen ceiling seem lower than it was. He extended his hand toward Mike in the human gesture of agreement that he'd learned 5 months ago. His hand trembled slightly. Teach us, Mike Crawford. Please. Teach my people how to farm again. Teach us what we forgot. Mike stood and gripped the prince's hand firmly, shaking it once. We start tomorrow morning. Fair warning though, Your Highness, it's going to be humbling work. There's no way around that. I've been humbled enough for one lifetime over the past 6 months, Davrik said with a wry smile. What's a little more? The next morning, as new harvest sun rose over the fields, Prince Davrik appeared at the Crawford barn wearing borrowed work clothes and boots. His entourage wanted to follow, but he'd ordered them to stay at the spaceport. This lesson required privacy and focus. Mike handed him a shovel and pointed at Ruby's habitat. First lesson, cleaning out the bedding. Ruby needs fresh material twice a week. Davrik stared at the shovel like he'd never seen such a primitive tool. You're joking. Nope, Mike said cheerfully. If you're going to teach your people to farm, you need to understand every part of it. That includes the dirty work. Literally. For the next 2 hours, a galactic prince mucked out animal bedding while Mike explained the reasoning behind every small detail. Why the bedding needed to be this specific depth. How to read Ruby's behavior to know when she was comfortable versus stressed. What signs indicated her diet needed adjustment. Beth recorded parts of it on her datapad, and despite Davrik's initial resistance, she uploaded select clips to the galactic networks. The images of a powerful prince doing manual farm labor went viral within hours. Some of Davrik's political enemies tried to use it as mockery, but it backfired. Ordinary citizens across dozens of worlds saw a leader willing to humble himself to learn something important. Respect for Prince Davrik actually increased. Other species took notice too. If the proud Talvarans were willing to learn human methods, maybe there was something to this approach after all. Messages started flooding into Mike's communication system. Worlds that had ignored him before suddenly wanted information. Agricultural officials who dismissed human methods as primitive now requested consultations. The lessons continued for weeks. Prince Davrik proved to be a dedicated student once he got past his initial pride. He learned to read animal behavior, to understand growth cycles that couldn't be rushed, to make tiny environmental adjustments based on observation rather than programming. He made mistakes, got frustrated, wanted to quit several times, but kept coming back every morning. This is impossible, Davrik complained one afternoon, watching Ruby interact with Kelly. She responds to your daughter immediately but barely tolerates me. How do I program that kind of bond? You don't program it, Mike explained patiently. You earn it. Kelly spent 6 months caring for Ruby every single day. Feeding her, talking to her, learning her moods. Ruby trusts Kelly because Kelly's proven herself trustworthy. There's no shortcut for that. Something shifted in Davrik's expression. Understanding maybe. Or acceptance. No shortcuts, he repeated quietly. That's the real lesson, isn't it? Not the techniques or the science. Just that there are no shortcuts to things that matter. Mike smiled. Now you're getting it. By the end of month 2, Prince Davrik had transformed as completely as Ruby had. He still carried himself with royal bearing, but there was a groundedness to him now. A humility earned through honest work. When he finally returned to his home world, he carried with him not just Ruby's offspring and detailed protocols, but genuine understanding. The real work of saving the Talvarin agricultural system was just beginning. But for the first time in years, there was real hope that it could be done. And it had started in a simple barn on a colony world most of the galaxy had never heard of, taught by a farmer in flannel and denim who understood that patience beats perfection every single time. One standard galactic year had passed since the wager. 12 months since Mike Crawford stood in a corner booth being laughed at by thousands. Now he stood at the entrance to Meridian Station's main exhibition hall, and everything felt different. The space station looked the same. Same gleaming corridors. Same artificial gravity that felt slightly too heavy for comfort. Same recycled air that tasted faintly metallic. But the atmosphere had changed in ways Mike could feel but couldn't quite name. This year's Galactic Agricultural Summit was the largest in recorded history. Attendance had tripled. Species that normally didn't attend agricultural conferences had sent representatives. The exhibition hall had been expanded twice to accommodate everyone, and it still felt crowded. Mike walked through the main entrance with Beth on one side and Kelly on the other. His daughter had grown an inch in the past year and carried herself with new confidence. She wore simple clothes like her parents, practical and clean, the outfit of someone who worked with their hands. But they weren't alone this time. Prince Davrik walked just behind them, and the change in him was remarkable. He wore no formal armor today. No ceremonial decorations. No symbols of royal authority. Instead, he had on work clothes that looked exactly like what Mike wore. Simple pants with reinforced knees. A sturdy shirt with actual dirt stains on the sleeves. Boots that had clearly walked through mud many times. The clothes weren't a costume or a publicity stunt. They were genuine workwear marked by honest labor. Behind the prince came more people. Kravik and his entire family had traveled from Thesha, for the desert world that was finally thriving after 50 years of struggle. His wife and 3 children walked with the confidence of people who no longer worried about where their next meal would come from. Representatives from 43 different worlds followed them through the entrance. Each one had adopted human farming methods over the past year. Each one had their own story of transformation. There were aquatic beings from Kelpis 7, their breathing apparatus allowing them to survive in the station's air. Mountain dwellers from the high-gravity world of Tor 3, their thick frames making them look solid as stone. Even a few crystalline life forms from the silicon planets of the outer reaches, their bodies chiming softly as they moved. Perhaps most surprising was the delegation of Talvarin farmers who walked at the back of the group. 6 months ago, these individuals would have considered manual agriculture beneath their dignity. They were from noble families, educated at the finest institutions, trained in advanced genetic engineering. But now they carried themselves like real farmers, with the same quiet pride Mike saw in his own reflection. The crowd in the exhibition hall noticed their entrance. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Media drones immediately swarmed toward them, cameras active and recording. Mike had been assigned booth space again this year, but not in a forgotten corner. The organizers had given him the entire central hall. The heart of the exhibition. The space where the most important displays traditionally went. It took 20 minutes to walk from the entrance to their assigned space because people kept stopping them. Scientists wanted to shake Mike's hand. Farmers from distant worlds thanked Beth for her instructional videos. Young students asked Kelly questions about working with Ruby. Everyone wanted a moment of their time. When they finally reached the central hall, Mike stopped and just looked at what his team had built. Ruby stood at the center of everything, positioned in a large, comfortable habitat that gave her room to move and display. She was magnificent now. Fully mature at 18 months old. Her feathers caught the artificial light and transformed it into shifting colors that seemed almost alive. Deep crimson flowed into brilliant gold, touched with violet and blue at the edges. Her crest rose proudly, and her intelligent eyes watched the gathering crowd with calm awareness. But Ruby wasn't alone. Beside her main habitat were 12 smaller enclosures, each containing one of her offspring at various stages of development. Some were still awkward juveniles, all legs and oversized eyes. Others were nearly mature, their adult plumage just beginning to show. Each one represented proof that Ruby's genetics were stable across generations. Around the edges of the central display were habitats containing specimens from other worlds. Scaled creatures from HFY 4 that Kravik had raised using Mike's methods. Aquatic breeders from Kelpis 7 that thrived in their water tanks. Even the crystalline life forms from the outer reaches, beings made of living silicon that somehow responded to patient animal husbandry the same way carbon-based life did. Every single specimen had been developed using observation and patience rather than genetic forcing. Every one represented a world that was building sustainable food production for the first time in generations. The crowd gathering around the display was enormous, but the mood was completely different from last year. Last year people came to mock and laugh. This year they came to learn. Scientists stood with notebooks, recording observations. Farmers asked detailed questions about feeding schedules and environmental controls. Even the most advanced genetic engineers in the galaxy were taking notes. The formal presentations were scheduled to begin in an hour. Mike spent that time answering questions, demonstrating Ruby's behavior, showing the data that proved everything he'd claimed a year ago. Beth handled the crowds with practiced ease, directing people to different parts of the display, scheduling private consultations for later. Kelly had become something of a celebrity, and young beings from dozens of species wanted to talk to the human girl who'd helped raise Ruby from an ugly hatchling into this magnificent creature. Finally, the announcement system chimed. The formal presentations were beginning. The crowd moved toward the central stage area, filling thousands of seats that had been set up. Media coverage was being broadcast to what Mike's datapad estimated as over 50 billion viewers across multiple star systems. The first speaker was Dr. Melissa, the elderly Talvran geneticist who'd become the voice of her empire's agricultural revolution. She moved slowly to the stage, her scales faded with age, but her mind remained sharp and her presence commanded immediate respect. The crowd fell silent the moment she reached the podium. 1 year ago, Dr. Melissa began, her words automatically translated into hundreds of languages through everyone's personal devices. I stood in a barn on a human colony world called New Harvest. I was there as part of Prince Davrick's delegation, there to witness what we all assumed would be a human failure. She paused, letting that statement hang in the air. Instead, I realized something that changed my entire understanding of agricultural science. Everything I had believed for 70 years of research was fundamentally flawed. We had confused speed with success. We had mistaken our ability to manipulate genetics for actual mastery over life itself. The massive display screens behind her lit up, showing comparison data. On one side, graphs tracked Talvran rapid growth livestock across multiple generations. The results looked impressive initially, but the decline was clear and devastating. By Generation 3, viability dropped by 23%. By Generation 5, complete genetic collapse. Sterility. Shortened lifespans. Offspring that couldn't survive without constant medical intervention. On the other side, graphs tracked Ruby and her offspring across the same timeline. The line was steady. Stable. No decline. Generation after generation maintaining 98% viability rates. We've run computer projections, Dr. Melissa continued, modeling these breeding lines out to Generation 50. The rapid growth method shows complete system failure by Generation 7. The human method maintains stability through all 50 projected generations. Perhaps beyond. We simply don't know where it stops being stable because our models can't find a breaking point. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Scientists leaned together, discussing the implications. This wasn't just about farming anymore. This was about fundamental approaches to working with life itself. But this is about more than numbers and data, Dr. Melissa said, her voice growing stronger. This is about philosophy. About the questions we ask. For centuries, the Talvran Empire has asked, how can we force life to serve us faster? How can we engineer perfection? How can we eliminate the waiting and the uncertainty? She gestured toward Mike's display, where Ruby preened her magnificent feathers calmly. Humans asked a different question. They asked, how can we work with life to build something sustainable? How can we understand what living things actually need instead of forcing them into what we want them to be? That difference in questions changes everything. It changes outcomes. It changes results. It changes whether your agricultural system lasts for a handful of generations or for centuries. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. We thought humans were primitive, Dr. Melissa said quietly. We thought their methods were outdated. We were wrong. They weren't behind us. They were ahead of us in the ways that actually matter. They never forgot what we had lost. She bowed her head slightly, a Talvran gesture of deep respect, toward where Mike sat with his family. Then she left the stage to thunderous applause that lasted several minutes. Prince Davrik took the stage next. The change in him over the past year was visible to anyone watching. He no longer moved with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never been challenged. There was humility in his posture now, earned through months of genuine hard work. "I lost a wager," Prince Davrik said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the translator system. "1 year ago I stood in this very hall and mocked a human farmer named Mike Crawford. I laughed at his ugly hatchling. I was absolutely convinced of Talvern's superiority. I believed our rapid growth methods, our genetic engineering, our technological advancement made us better at everything, including agriculture." He paused and a slight smile crossed his scaled features. "I was completely, utterly, embarrassingly wrong." Laughter rippled through the audience, but it was warm laughter, not mocking. "But losing that wager gave me something far more valuable than pride," Davrik continued. "It gave me understanding. Over the past year, I have spent 6 months on New Harvest, working on Mike Crawford's farm. And I mean actually working. I cleaned animal bedding. I prepared food by hand. I learned to read behavior and adjust environments based on observation instead of programming." The screens behind him lit up with images. Prince Davrik mucking out Ruby's habitat. Prince Davrik hand-feeding juveniles. Prince Davrik covered in dirt and looking exhausted but genuinely happy. The images had circulated widely over the past months, becoming symbols of a leader willing to humble himself to learn something important. "I learned something that my grandfather knew but that my generation had forgotten," Davrik said. "Patience isn't weakness. Slow development isn't failure. Working with nature instead of forcing it isn't primitive. These things are actually the foundation of everything that lasts." He turned and gestured toward the delegation of Talvern farmers sitting in the audience. "These individuals, these brave people, have committed to farming again. Real farming. They've given up rapid results in favor of sustainable results. They've traded speed for strength. And they're not alone." The screens changed again, showing farms across the Talvern Empire where the transformation was happening. Genetic engineering facilities being converted into traditional farming operations. Young Talverons learning animal husbandry from human instructors. Fields that were being planted with crops that would take months to grow instead of days. "The human Mike Crawford taught me that patience isn't just a virtue," Davrik said. "It's a practical necessity for anything that matters. My entire empire needed to learn that lesson. We're learning it now and it's saving us from collapse." He looked directly at Mike in the audience. "I came here last year to humiliate a human farmer. I'm here this year to honor him and to announce something to the galaxy." The crowd leaned forward, sensing something important was coming. The Talvern Empire is establishing the Crawford Fellowship, a fully funded program to train agricultural specialists from any world in sustainable farming methods. Any species, any background, any level of technology. If you want to learn how to farm the way humans do, the way our ancestors did before we forgot, the program will teach you at no cost. The audience erupted in applause. Mike felt Beth squeeze his hand tightly. Kelly was trying not to cry. "Humanity gave us knowledge freely when they could have charged billions," Davrik concluded. "This is how we begin to repay that debt. This is how we honor the lesson they taught us." The prince bowed deeply toward Mike, a gesture of profound respect in Talvern culture, then left the stage. The presentations continued for hours, but the message was clear. The galaxy was changing. Species across dozens of star systems were abandoning rapid growth methods in favor of sustainable approaches. Agricultural specialists who dismissed human methods were now studying them intensely. Young farmers from advanced civilizations were coming to places like New Harvest to learn from humans who they'd considered primitive just a year ago. As the day wound down, Mike found himself standing with Kelly in front of Ruby's habitat. The magnificent creature was resting, her latest clutch of eggs carefully guarded. The crowds had thinned, but people still stopped to observe, to take notes, to ask one more question. "Dad," Kelly said quietly, "do you remember what you told me last year? About believing versus knowing?" Mike nodded. "I remember. You said you believed Ruby would succeed, but you didn't know for certain. That it was faith backed by experience." "That's right." Kelly watched Ruby for a moment longer. "I think I understand now. It's not just about farming. It's about life. Sometimes you just have to do the work, trust the process, and have faith that good things grow from patience." Mike put his arm around his daughter's shoulders and pulled her close. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from watching you," Kelly said simply. Ruby chirped from her habitat, that clear melodic sound that had become familiar to billions of viewers across the galaxy. The sound of patience rewarded. The sound of slow growth becoming lasting strength. And in that moment, standing in the central hall of the Galactic Agricultural Summit, surrounded by proof that human wisdom had changed the galaxy, Mike Crawford felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Pride. Not in being right but in helping. In teaching. In showing the galaxy that sometimes the old ways weren't outdated. Sometimes slow was exactly what the universe needed. The harvest had come in. And it was more abundant than he'd ever imagined possible.